There is a lot of hoopla surrounding Alabama and Ole Miss. Now, Alabama will host the Rebels, and I think when we look at this game, we have to take a lot of things into account. What we've seen up to this point for either team might not necessarily be applicable in this game. There's so much familiarity on the staff. Lane Kiffin knows Nick Saban like the back of his hand. Pete Golding, the defensive coordinator for Ole Miss, he was on Nick Saban's staff for a very, very long time. Don't think for a second this one hasn't been circled for a really long time if you're Pete Golding and if you're Lane Kiffin. Lane Kiffin's 0-3 against his former boss, but he's played him pretty close. This will be a really big opportunity for Ole Miss to go into Tuscaloosa and potentially knock off the Tide, who appear at the moment to be just a little bit vulnerable. The big thing for Ole Miss, they have to be able to run the football. They really didn't run the ball very well in their first two games, just 232 yards rushing in the first two games. Against Georgia Tech, they had 299 yards. But here's the problem. Quinshon Judkins was not really much of a factor, or at least has not been much of a factor in the run game up to this point. Last week's near 300-yard effort was in large part due to what Jackson Dart provided. Right now, Jackson Dart is leading the SEC in rushing by a quarterback. He's 50 yards north of what Jaden Daniels at LSU has done. So he is doing a great job. Great job running the football with 213 rushing yards up to this point, but he's been deadly accurate as well. He's made some really good decisions with the football with capable weapons on the perimeter. Last year, Quinshon Judkins was a man in this game. He ran for 135 yards, 2 touchdowns against Alabama. So that was the best performance by a running back against Alabama since Nick Chubb back in 2015. So he, I think, needs to replicate that performance for Ole Miss to effectively and consistently move the football. Here's the next question. Can Alabama run the football? Because we came into the season saying this is going to be a ground and pound style of attack. This is a murder ball outfit. They have 3 offensive linemen that weigh 350 or more, 2 that weigh 360 or more, 1 that's nearing 370. So what we thought is that they'd be able to move people off the ball. They'd just be able to lean on people, and they would just ultimately wear teams out along the front. Well, it hasn't really materialized up to this point. Yes, well, last week against South Florida, Roydell Williams got going, 124 yards and a touchdown in the second half of that football game. Really, the first 5 halves of the game, Roydell Williams has been pretty quiet, just 53 rushing yards in the first 5 halves of the football game. But the overall inconsistency of the group running the football has been a little problematic. Right now, Alabama is 66th out of 130 FBS teams in rushing yards per attempt, about 4.5 yards per carry. It takes into account yardage lost on sacks, so you got to take that with a grain, but more on that in a minute. But overall, 4.5 yards per carry is 8th in the SEC. That's not going to be good enough. They're only 172 yards per game on the ground. That's 56th in college football and 7th in the SEC. Now, Jalen Milroe's your guy. You know he's your quarterback. He needs designed runs, whether it's quarterback sweeps, quarterback sprints. He's got to constantly be moving. If Jalen Milroe is ever stationary in the pocket, I think that's a bad recipe. He's got to be on the move. He's got to be off misdirection. You got to have bootlegs, sprint outs, all those things that help feature his dynamic playmaking ability. And in the process, you can simplify some of the passing reads as well. But he's got to be a huge factor in the run game moving forward to complement what should be a pretty deep stable of backs, but a group of backs that isn't necessarily at this point playing high-level football. This group collectively has to be a whole lot better against an Ole Miss group that has been pretty dang good so far, allowing just 2.88 yards per carry. Granted, it's Mercer, Tulane, and Georgia Tech. But last year, they're 4.23. So they're 1.5 yards better than they were a year ago. So they are significantly improved on that side of the ball, especially when it comes to stopping the run. But Jalen Milroe hopefully will provide a little bit of a spark to the run game for Alabama moving forward. Here's the other thing. If Alabama is off schedule, for instance, they're behind the sticks, they don't gain 4 or 5 yards on first down running the football, can they protect their quarterback? So far, Alabama quarterbacks have been sacked 5 times in the last 2 weeks. 5 against Texas, 5 against South Florida. It's the first time since 2005 that Alabama's had 5 sacks in consecutive games. Rebs so far, they have 10 sacks this season. That's the 3rd most in the SEC. So those tackles have to be a whole lot better. So many other aspects of this game that I'm interested in. Obviously, the coaching battle, the X's and the O's, trying to create matchups. I love the way Alabama's defense played last week. I think they played smart. It looked like a simpler plan. They were able to play a lot faster. I thought the secondary did a great job tracking the ball. This will be a much more difficult task, knowing some of the matchups that Ole Miss can create. But I like the way Alabama's secondary matches up against Ole Miss weapons. I think this game is going to be one at the line of scrimmage. Whoever offensive line and defensive line plays better, that's who's ultimately going to win the game. And of course, naturally, it's going to come down to turnovers. If Jalen Milroe is careless with the football, Ole Miss will win the game. If Alabama keeps a clean sheet offensively and they have zero turnovers, maybe force one or two themselves, then Alabama will win the game. I like Alabama to win the game. I like them close. I would not lay the points, but I like the Tide to win outright.